Hello, fiendlings. How the hell are you? I spent yesterday splicing together the podcast for the Black Outbreak, and boy howdy is it big. 30 episodes will be dropping one per week for 30 weeks. When does that start? When Arrival ends. And when is that? Next week. As for the writing, I'm still working on a new book while spending time with the Evolution manuscript. We are almost ready to start production on the ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook. Almost. No, I don't have a timeline for Evolution's release in any of its formats, but I hope to have that information in the next couple of weeks. With that, it's time I got back to work. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 20 of The Black, Arrival.
Wish I'd taken up knitting, Jay said. Then maybe I'd carry some needles on me. Kate sighed. And how exactly would that help? He shrugged and clicked the knife in his hands. The tiny, gleaming razor edge jutted out a little further. They'd found the knife in one of the many toolboxes. It had worked well on the last remaining portions of Kate's chem suit. Once they'd torn it into strips, he and Kate took turns with the knife as they liberated the metal threads. The room was growing colder, not warmer. Instead of just smelling of dirt, debris, and mold, the new building's lab area also smelled of rain. The storm, the first cold one of the season, was out there. They couldn't hear it. They couldn't see it, but Jay damned sure felt it. Several long, thin metal threads lay atop a strip of cloth from Jay's t-shirt. Kate wound them together with nimble fingers. The piece of metal had to be wide enough to make a firm connection to the contacts. Jay also wanted it to be thick enough to not snap. He looked up at the ceiling. The creaking sound was more frequent now, more disturbing. The sound of something being dragged through the ducts. They didn't have much time, and Jay didn't think they'd have more than one shot. Maeve wasn't asleep, but she had her eyes closed. Her foot twitched with nervous energy. Jay hoped the meds were finally helping. If they could kill the M2, maybe the CDC would even let them out. Kate finished winding the threads together. Jay studied them and then checked the rest of their supplies. Strips of cloth? Check. Bits of paper scrounged from the floor? Check. Charged high-power battery? Check. Metal for the contacts? Check. Well, I think you made Eagle. Kate blinked at him. She opened her mouth and then started to giggle. I was never even in the Girl Scouts. Well, doesn't matter, Jay said. That's a fine smorgasbord of burnable materials. Is that the technical term? I could have said flammable shit. Would that have been better? She punched him in the arm. His bare skin stung from the blow. He faked a wince and then laughed. You punch like a girl. She hit him again, harder. This time the wince was real, but the laughter was louder. Adults, Maeve said. You guys are more immature than I am. A metallic shriek echoed in the room. The three of them flinched. Jay turned and looked up at the ceiling. There was no ductwork immediately above them. Thank God for small favors, he thought. But just a few meters from the circle of light, ductwork crisscrossed the ceiling. Okay, Jay said. That was well timed. His shaky voice matched the trembling in his hands. So, Kate, it can't pour out on top of us. So where do we set the trap? She looked up and followed the ducts as he had. Kate bit her lip. Jay tried to be patient, but it was agonizing. He couldn't think. If the M2 was coming down the ducts from the second floor, it could drop nearly anywhere. Or could it? She nodded to herself and then pointed. See that vent in the middle? He followed her finger and then blushed. Of course. The ductwork met in the center with a register. The register wasn't yet complete. Hell, the metal vent covers hadn't even been affixed. How long will it take us to start the fire? He shrugged. A minute or two, I think. I never did it with a battery this big. Only ever used a 9-volt. She blinked at him. You think this is going to work on this kind of battery? I hope it will. He cleared his throat. Unless you have a better idea. Kate sighed. No, I don't. Another metallic shriek echoed through the room. A dull thudding noise followed. Shit, Jay said. It's in the ducts. Well, light this shit, Kate yelled. He picked up the wound wire and jammed one end into the negative contact hole. When he let go, the wire sprang back out. Oh, fuck, he said. You mean it's not going to work? Kate asked. Her wild eyes bore into his. He growled, put the metal back into the hole, and then stuffed one of the strips of cloth to plug it. When he let go, the wire stayed. He snapped off the plastic covering for the positive contact and did the same. Jay touched the middle of the wire. The flesh on his index finger burned. He pulled it out and sucked on it. "Well, I think it worked," he said around his finger. "Well, that's—" Metal expanded. Aluminum and steel made to channel air buckled beneath incredible weight. Still holding the battery, Jay walked out of the circle of light. "Jay?" Her voice barely registered in his mind. Once his eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw the source of the noise. Jay's mouth opened, and his eyes widened. The metal ducts closest to the far wall were warped and dimpled. He watched as each successive duct sagged and lost its rectangular shape. M2 had squeezed itself in. Jesus, he thought. How big is it now? The sliding, dragging sound became a roar. The ductwork started to shake in the ceiling. Metal rattled. A bolt gave way, and one of the duct connections buckled with a shriek. "Jay!" Kate screamed. He turned to her. She was screaming for him to start the fire, to do something, anything. But his brain was slow. It took forever for his eyes to glance down at the cloth in her hands. Fire. He was supposed to start the fire, but she was so far away, and the noise was so loud, and the ground shook as something dropped from the ceiling. Jay turned back to the noise. Most of the ductwork had come loose and crashed into the concrete. A cloud of dust rose from the floor. Jay stared into the dust. Kate's screams barely registered. He could hardly see anything through the motes hanging in the air, but what he did see unhinged him. The ducts were a wreck of metal. They had collapsed into the floor, leaving dented concrete and shards of steel in their wake. The very center of the line of ducts trembled. Metal squealed and then crunched as a black tentacle shot out through them. It descended and formed into a hook. It ripped along the duct seams like a can opener and then split apart. The metal detonated as an impossibly black form rose from the wreckage. Appendages squeezed out of the ooze. Tentacles, spidery legs, stalks that ended with orbs darker than space. It stood on 7 1-meter-high segmented legs. The appendages were several meters long and growing. A huge maw opened in the creature's midsection. A circle of teeth appeared, their ends lighter than the gaping hole behind them. Its eye stalks waved and then stared straight at Jay. The thing seemed to roar, but was silent as death. Then it started to move. Its spidery legs crackled and smashed through the remaining duct steel. Its talons clicked on the concrete floor as it scuttled forward. Jay was lost. His eyes were locked on the orbs, lost within them. It was coming. He could do nothing. His hands started to burn, but he couldn't look away. He gritted his teeth against the pain, and then something smacked him in the shoulder. He was dimly aware of movement, and then someone was wresting the battery from his hands. Kate moved into view. She was running toward the creature even as it moved toward them. It was only 5 meters from her when she stopped, wound up, and threw the burning battery at the creature. The cloth, Jay thought. The cloth holding the wires must have caught fire. The creature's eye stalks, all pointed, and tracked the fireball as it flew through the air. The creature tried to back away, but it only managed to step. The battery fell into its gaping maw even as it tried to catch it with its tentacles. For a moment, nothing happened. The creature stared at them, its razor-sharp tentacles stretching toward them. Jay was still frozen in place when Kate turned and ran at him. She tackled him to the floor, and then the world exploded. The creature detonated in a fireball. Its tentacles didn't come off. They just ceased to exist. The same with its legs and the center that had once been a terrifying, razor-ringed mouth. The fire spread out along the concrete floor, setting anything flammable alight. Jay's mind finally snapped back into place. His hand screamed in pain, and he was pretty sure Kate's tackle had sprained his ankle, or broken it. He raised his head and looked over her shoulder. The creature was gone. Only fire remained. Kate rose on stiff limbs and offered him her hand. "You okay?" Jay winced. Sufferin' succotash woman, you nearly shattered my back. It was either that or risk you getting torched. He took her hand. She pulled him to his feet. He hobbled on his ankle past her so he could see the carnage. Dark smoke rose above the flames. Jesus, Jay said. A massive scorch mark lay where the creature stood when it combusted. The concrete was stained and looked as though it was broken in places. He stifled a cough and then failed. The smoke was starting to be a little too much. He turned back to Kate. We have to get out of here. How? She asked. They've got the outer doors locked and blocked. Jay stared at the stairwell door and pointed. That thing is gone. We can go back upstairs, get into the knock and see if there's a phone or anything still working. Hell, maybe our cell phones will work up there. Maeve groaned behind them. We really have to move again. Kate chuckled. Hey, did you like the fireworks show? The girl grinned despite the pain in her shoulder. It was pretty cool. I thought you guys were going to start a fire, not throw a hand grenade. Jay laughed. The cloth I used to secure the battery connections. The wire must have warmed enough to set it off. He stared down at his right hand. The skin was black in places, striated with crimson. Shit, he looked at Kate. Got anything in that med kit for burns? Her eyes stared down at the wound. That looks 3rd degree, Jay. Why did you just stand there? He blinked. I don't know. It looked at me. Like it was... He shook his head. I don't know. She sighed. Let's table that for now. Let me get some bandages and see if we can find something for that hand. There were 3 Bunsen burners in the chem lab. The problem? They were in the chem lab. Neil and Mike walked outside into the hall and then stood at the entryway to the lab. Neil glanced at the glass wall. Bill watched them from his chair, his face a bit more pale than Neil liked. He stared into the chem lab. The distillation equipment was melted in places. The gaping, scorched hole in the ceiling was terrifying. The idea that that thing could just reach down and pluck them into its mouth was more than just a little disconcerting. He didn't want to go in there, but it was the only way. The only goddamned way they were going to get through this. And even then the odds weren't exactly in their favor. The plan? Set fire to the M2 that was still in the dispensing station. Neil wished he could take credit for it, but it had been Bill's idea. Opening the barrel up and setting it on fire would be next to impossible if they didn't want to risk releasing it from its temporary prison. But if they managed to set the M2 on fire in the pipes, it should travel back into the barrel and ignite all of it. Regardless of whether or not it worked, they were going to be in a world of shit. There was no telling what would happen once that much of it was alight. It could explode. It could do nothing. Or, more frightening, the M2 could just stream out of the pipe and kill them all. They'd have to break the vacuum to force air into the system. Neil hoped Bill was right about that, too. The pipes had a purge system to force air and clear them. But if they couldn't get it to go in reverse, it meant they'd have to drain the pipes and the barrel into the lab. At that point, all bets were off. Neil didn't want to think about it. How do you want to do this? Mike asked. Neil glanced at his worry-lined face. His eyes burned with something akin to anger. It actually made Neil feel a bit better. At least he had one pissed-off wingman. See that table over there by the distillation analyzer? He pointed a finger toward it. Mike nodded. There's a burner over there with an auto-igniter. The only problem is the tubing connecting it to the gas jets. But there are lots of gas jets in here. We just need to disconnect the burner, take it to the dispenser, reconnect it, and then figure out what's next. Mike blinked. Why can't we figure that out now? Because, Neil licked his lips, I don't know if the computer controls were damaged. If they were, we're going to have to think fast. If that thing comes back down here, we're not going to have a whole lot of time. That's easy, Mike said. We turn on the gas jets, auto-ignite the burner, and let the gas do its job. Neil gulped. That could cause one hell of an explosion, Mike. I'm not sure we'd survive it if we were outside the lab, but we'll be blown to smithereens if we're inside when it happens. I don't care. Mike's eyes were hard steel. I'll let that shit into this place. I'm sure as hell not letting it back out. We can't have this stuff out there. No fucking way. He shook his head. If I ever see Simpson again, I'll kill him with my bare hands." For a moment, neither man said a word. Neil tried to put the idea of them blowing themselves up out of his mind. Mike was right, of course. If the CDC or whoever the fuck had been on the radio was telling the truth, they were already losing a battle with an M2 entity at Ben Taub. Should the house sample of M2 get loose, there was no telling what would happen. If it reached the sewers, it could eventually destroy the city. "Okay," Neil said at last. "I'm with you. Let's just plan on blowing ourselves up as a last resort, okay?" Mike grinned. "I didn't say it was my first choice, Neil." "I hoped that was the case." Neil turned back to the lab. "You know the plan? Unhook the burner, take the hose, and meet you at the dispenser." Neil nodded. "Right. Easy peasy." "Easy peasy," Mike echoed. "Let's do this." Neil opened the door to the chem lab and stepped inside. The room stank of burned plastic and rotten meat. He stifled the urge to retch and suddenly wished they'd brought their gas masks. He was about to say something about it when Mike pelted past him toward the burner. Neil cursed and followed as fast as he could. Mike made it to the burner station before Neil was even halfway to the sample dispenser. He slowed and looked up at the gaping hole in the ceiling. The hole exposed ductwork, pipes, and electrical wiring. He tried to ignore the feeling he was being watched through that hole and headed to the dispensing station. The computer was still working. That was something, at least. He brought it to life and logged in. The system took a moment and then returned with a login failure. "Fuck you," Neil said. The network was trashed. It couldn't contact the authentication server. He clicked OK and then grinned. Because the scientists were always losing their passwords, Chuckles had set the labs up with connections to the network, but also with a root password. They were only supposed to use the root account if there was a network failure. Now was the time. Neil typed it in and waited as the computer thought about it. The screen flashed and filled with a UI. From here, Neil could control most of the equipment in the chem lab. Fortunately, there was only one item of interest on his mind. He brought up the UI for the dispensing station. The screen flashed again, and a new window filled the screen. Neil scanned the interface and looked at the system health bar. According to the sensors monitoring the piping system and the dispenser, there were no problems with pressure and the system seemed intact. "I think we're in business," Neil said without turning around. "Everything's green and we still have pressure." "Good," Mike said. "I've almost got this connection loose." "Just don't turn on the gas jet by accident. That would be a bad thing." "Noted," Mike said. As Neil searched through the commands on the interface, Mike huffed and puffed behind him. The clinking of metal against metal was hard to miss. He hoped like hell Mike was being careful. If a jet came on while he was messing around back there, that metal on metal could deliver a spark that would blow them both to kingdom come. At least M2 would die with us, he thought. Or hoped. He clicked through the menu and searched for maintenance mode. He found it and looked at the description. Neil nodded as he read it. He clicked a button, and a new menu popped up. They could bleed air from the system if the vacuum wasn't sealed. They could flush the system with water, or they could force air into the pipes for a purge. As he searched, worry lines appeared on his forehead. What he was looking for, hoping for, wasn't there. The only way to get air into the system would also force the oil into the lab. Shit. He barely heard Mike's footsteps behind him. "Something wrong?" Mike asked. Neil hissed between his teeth. "Like I was afraid of. The goddamned purge is one way only. We can force the pipes to empty through the nozzle," he said, pointing to the metal and glass faucet. "In a purge. But that means we're going to bring all that shit into the lab." Mike grunted. "No way to force it the other way?" Neil shook his head. "I don't see a way to reverse it. The software doesn't support that, and I've no idea how to jury-rig it." He thrummed his fingers on the table. "Shit!" Mike put the burner on the table and dropped the hose next to it. He pointed to a gleaming metal nozzle on the wall. "Is that the gas?" "Yeah." "Okay." Mike shuffled forward and put one end of the rubber hose on the nozzle. He fidgeted with it for a moment until he seemed happy. "One end in." "Doesn't matter," Neil said. "We can't set what's in the pipes on fire. We'd have to somehow get the flame up into the pipes." Mike ignored him and connected the hose to the burner. "Fuck that," We get some buckets or something from the storage area, flood the M2 into them, and set them alight. It'll burn as it enters the buckets, no problem. Neil stared at him. You're out of your mind, Mike. We don't know what that shit will do once it's out of the pipes. It could just fly right out of the buckets and into our faces. Mike shrugged. But it'll die, like us. Man, Neil said, you really are pissed off. Yes. Yes, I am. I have 2 destroyed buildings, dead friends, and an army of assholes outside that are unwilling to help. So yeah, he growled, I'm pissed off. Before we do that, let me think. Neil stared at the vacuum pump mechanism. It was quite simple, really. The airtight connections at either end ensured no air could enter the system. Once everything was connected, the pump bled all the air from the pipes. After that, the dispenser end opened a valve and the fluid trapped in the pipes would flow through. When the valve was shut again, the vacuum in the pipes was restored. But how to get it to go the other way? If he attempted to purge the system, air would flow through another valve toward the beginning of the pipe system. He pursed his lips. To perform a purge, they couldn't have the barrel connected anyway. Shit, Neil scratched his head. Okay, he turned to Mike. Mike's eyebrows were raised. Here's what we can do. We set the burner down, ignite it, and I set the dispenser to allow a very slow trickle of liquid. Once it starts catching fire, any additional M2 that exits the system will automatically ignite. And if it doesn't? Mike asked. We'll let whatever's left in the barrel out into the lab, and we won't really have a way to stop it. So, Mike said, either we leave this crap where it is, or we take our chances. He looked around the lab. How many more of those gas nozzles are there? I don't know, 10, 12? Neil scrunched his eyebrows together. What the hell you got up your sleeve? A slow, sadistic grin spread across Mike's face. Help me find another hose, 2 if possible. You're going to show me what to do, and then you're going to get the hell out of here. You're crazy. Mike laughed and shook his head. No, believe me, I don't want to die in here. And you're going to have to get Bill and Hoyt the hell out of here. Get them to the building foyer. Hide there. If it comes for you, do your best to get away. That's a shit plan, Neil said. Got a better one? No, I don't. Neil grabbed the burner and placed it beneath the spout. He exited the maintenance interface and brought up the main dispensing program. He could set a timer. He could set flow. How long would Mike need? He exhaled through his teeth. Okay, let's find those hoses first.